Vikrant Dadawala, thank you for agreeing to the interview. So
Hi,
let's start
Kane.
with
Thanks for having me.
let's talk about your two courses that you're teaching in the fall and winter terms. There are two full year courses. You just want to explain what they are and what students can get out of it.
Sure. So I'll start with South Asian literature, which is a course I'm really excited to teach at York in Toronto. This course is, I think of it as a curated introduction to the most sublime, the most beautiful, the most moving works of literature from South Asia, by which I mean India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and Nepal. We're really going to be reading very widely across a range of genres. So we're going to start with ancient Sanskrit epics that were passed down orally over centuries. We're going to look at compendiums of Buddhist wisdom. We're going to look at Sufi songs of love and longing. We're going to look at devotional hymns by Mira, for instance, who speaks of God in very erotic and intimate terms. We're going to look at
Mhm.
poems, very beautiful, moving poems by Guru Nanak, the founder of the Sikh faith. And then we're going to look at modern literature of all kinds: memoirs, novels, short stories, poems. And here too, we're going to aim for a really big range. So starting with memoirs by former untouchables, stories of how they sort of defeated that condition of oppression and discrimination, to stories of resilience and grit and change from the global diaspora, from really all over the world. So it's a big course with a big sort of time range, a lot of breadth, a lot of depth. I really hope that students who are interested in South Asia for whatever reason, right? It could be you have some heritage from there. It could be you have family and you want to try and understand them and their lives
Mhm.
more. Maybe you're interested in the major faiths from that region and cultural traditions or languages. Maybe you just want to know what's happening in this part of the world where there are so many billions of people, and which is always in the news and not always for the right reasons, right?
Mhm.
Whatever your reason for being interested in this course, my hope is that you're going to walk away after a year with a real deep well of knowledge and art that you can draw on, and and hopefully this is gonna be something you'll just have for the rest of your life, even if you don't decide to study South Asia more, study South Asian literature more. You'll always be able to. You'll always have this grasp on what has this region really offered to the world over really millennia of history. So that's course one, South Asian literature, which, as you said, is a year-long course. The second course is an introduction to post-colonial literatures in English. The focus here is gonna be a little more recent. We're going to look at literature from Asia, from Africa, from the islands of the Pacific Ocean, from the Caribbean. And we're going to look at some of the most sort of exciting and acclaimed works of English lit from the last 100 years or so. I think the course includes 3 Nobel Prize winners and the winners of a host of other sort of major awards. Um, our focus is really stories of travel, migration, exile, or self-discovery, right? Stories of encounters between Africans, Europeans, Asians, Indigenous Americans. And the aim here is to use literature to understand some of the most pressing issues of contemporary times. So that includes war, colonialism, mass migration, but take a literary perspective, right? And what I mean by
Mhm.
that is we're going to be interested in subtle truths. We're going to be interested in nuance. And we're also going to look for whatever stories we can find that go beyond cruelty and anger and injustice, but also look for redemption, also look for beauty, also look for wonder, enchantment, and friendship. So another course that I'm very, very excited to teach, also year long. And yeah, please let me know if you have any follow-up questions. And students, prospective students are also free to reach out to me via email.
Mhm. Yeah, I'm interested in how did this sort of interest. Well, let's go back a bit. Like, how did you first become like an English professor? How did your interest in South Asian literature, like post-colonial literature? I saw you also did courses on film in the past. Like, how
Yeah.
did all of this start? What got you really into it?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I don't know if I have a clear answer. It's kind of, to me, like this question is sort of like asking, how did you become interested in life, right? It's really tough to pinpoint how and when this happened. But so a little bit about me. I was born in Kolkata in India. That's where I grew up, and always loved books, just devoured them. I was always
Mhm.
reading. reading in English and in Hindi, which are the two languages I work in. Just reading constantly. I did a
Uh,
degree in English. Sorry, go on.
did you grow up in a home where you were kind of like surrounded by books? What was this something your parents encouraged?
A little bit, yeah. I mean, I won't say my parents were the biggest readers, but I don't know. They always thought this was something sort of safe and academic, I think. And little did they realize
Uh,
this would take me very far from the kind of career they might have envisioned from me. So it
okay.
did not lead to did not lead to STEM, did not lead to law or medicine. My dad's a doctor, but
Uh-huh.
instead I just kept diving deeper and deeper into books. So I did a degree in English in India at a very sort of one of the institutes that came out of the nationalist movement and had lots of traditions of bilingual teaching and learning, and I was very fortunate to study there. And then I moved to the US a little later. I've been here for about 10 years now. I did a PhD in English at the University of Pennsylvania, and then the last 3 years I've been at Harvard teaching in a history and literature program. So yeah, I've been doing this now for a while, and I think South Asian literature for me is a source of enduring mystery and wonder, right? I
Mhm.
think there are very few. Let me rephrase that. I don't want to. I don't want to claim exceptionalist, make exceptionalist claims about South Asia. But what I will say is that if you pick up a poem by somebody like Rabindranath Tagore, who was the first non-white person to win a Nobel Prize in literature, you can
Mhm.
see centuries and centuries in that one poem. That's about, let's say, the life of a clerk in squalid conditions in colonial Calcutta. But you can feel the pull of South Asian traditions of classical music, of traditions of thinking about God and the soul. All of this is still there. So, at the risk of getting all theoretical, I would say what really attracts me is South Asian literature's ability to be something we in literary studies call a palimpsest, which is a piece of manuscript which has been written over many times.
Sorry,
And
could you
these can
repeat
be
that? A
a palimpsest. So that's P A
and
L
it's
I M P S E T. It's a manuscript that's been used and reused many times.
mhm.
So what you see one piece of writing, but then if you study it under the right conditions in a lab, you can see layers and layers of writing below it because the same piece of paper has been reused again and again. And so that one document can contain multiple languages, multiple histories, can
Mhm.
really sort of pull you in for days and days and hours. So that quality of South Asian lit is something I find very, very enchanting. So that's kind of what drove me towards South Asian lit. For post-colonial lit, I think it's sort of a condition of being a thinking person today is engaging with the bittersweet legacies of colonialism, right? And I say bittersweet because I don't want to only focus on the destruction. There's also the creation of, let's say, a new kind of English, right, which can be roomy and hospitable and have room for all kinds of voices and all kinds of accents and people from all over the world. So, what drives me towards post-colonial literature is really a search for the stories of ordinary people and small lives lived in the shadows of big empires. And I think that's very, very fulfilling. And that really gives a kind of depth to our engagement with history and with politics too, right? So we can go beyond slogans, we can go beyond theory. I know you're in political science, so maybe you have a fondness for theory, but we can sort of go beyond what can sometimes be arid in the world of theory and really explore subtleties and nuance. And that's kind of what drives me towards post-colonial literature, right? It's sort of a story of self-discovery too.
Mhm. Yeah, that's all really interesting. And you mentioned Rabindranath Tagore. So like I am Bengali. I was born here, but
Yeah.
yeah, I was reading. I haven't read much of his work, but I recently realized that like I was trying to learn more about Bangladeshi history, but also like as an ethnic group, Bengali history, and going into the whole genetic like ancestry, like where do these people kind of come from? How did the language evolve, and so on. And the more I tried to learn, like I realized there's so many things like that were only written in Bangla. So if I wanted to understand it, I would have to improve my Bangla. So I'm curious, like, what issues have you come up? Because you said you speak Hindi and English. Do you speak any other languages?
I do speak Bengali too, but it's
Okay,
not as good as Hindi and English, so I'm a little quieter about my Bengali. Yeah.
yeah.
But
So I was
so
curious, like,
yeah, so the course I'm teaching is all in translation, so it's all going to be in
yeah,
English. But there are issues of translation for sure.
Hmm.
What I like to do in the classroom is I like to bring the original text. If I can't read the language, I just bring a recording. And I want us to hear it, to hear the strangeness of the
Hmm.
original syllables, and then look at the translation. And sometimes we also look at two translations, right? Which also is
Yeah.
a way of sort of reaching towards the original, which yes, I agree. You can only really access in the original language. But I think there's a lot that translations carry too,
Yeah.
right? So, for instance, the Tagore stuff we'll be reading in this class includes a beautiful, beautiful poem. I have read it in the Bangla as well, but the translation is also very good. It's by a British poet who got really into Tagore, really into Bengali, and I think it's very strong. I've taught this before, and you don't need to be Bengali. You don't need to know anything about the region to really feel the
Mhm.
pull of that poem, for instance. So, yeah.
Yeah. I'm curious, have you by any chance read it's a collection of essays. It's called, I believe, Translating Myself and Others by Jim Giri.
I haven't read this collection, no. But I have read a lot of Jhumpa Lahiri, and I can sort of guess what she's saying there a little bit because I
Yeah.
know her views about Italian and a desire to sort of
Yeah. I'm just curious,
escape.
like,
Yeah.
yeah, I'm curious, like, have you had any experiences where like maybe like reading certain texts or reading authors from different regions, like do you find like it's affected how you maybe you adapt certain views, or maybe you're more sympathetic to certain views like when you read those works? I'm curious, what has your experience been as a reader of like different work?
That's a good question. I think the answer is definitely yes, right? There's nothing that opens up your world as much as reading something in translation, because there's
Mhm.
always a little bit of foreignness that carries over, right? And then you need to say yes to the book. You need to say, I'm not going to be turned off by this. I'm not going to say I don't understand why it isn't this clear. I'm going to say yes, and I'm going to read it. And I think that's a very, very rewarding process. And you emerge at the end with a different self. So absolutely, this has absolutely happened to me, and I think this is absolutely a quality of reading works in translation. And I think this is also what Jhumpa Lahiri is celebrating about Italian too, right? That Italian just opens up a whole new tradition and world for her. And she's trilingual, to the best of my knowledge. I know that she does speak some Bengali as well,
Mhm.
and she's a very acclaimed writer in English, and now she's writing in Italian. So I do think that's the best kind of life. I translate myself from Hindi a little bit, and there's no better way to understand a book too than translating it. I feel like that's the best way to really dig into why this word and why not this word. Why are the sentences short and not long? Why does the paragraph end here and not later? But I'm very confident that an open-minded reader can take a lot from translation, even if
Mhm.
even if you don't speak the original language, and especially if it's in a classroom setting where you have all kinds of help too, right? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm wondering, like we always hear this sort of as early as like high school, like I'm not sure what it was like in India or like or what school you went to, but um like in on in the province of Ontario, like in our curriculum, it's really common for high schools to have like a Shakespeare text in every high school grade. And one of like the debates that students and teachers would always have is, is it still necessary to teach Shakespeare? Is it
Mm.
maybe non-inclusive? Is it maybe like outdated? I was just wondering in regards to South Asian literature, like why do you think students should read it? Why do you like just like an average student, either in English or outside of English? What place do you think it has, sort of in like what place do you think English translations have in like the sort of like literary canon? What are some differences? Like, what do you think it brings to the table in terms of like sort of a complete education?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll put it this way, right? South Asia has been the cradle of some of the world's most popular religions, right?
Hmm.
Hinduism, Islam, Buddhism, Sikhism, right? If you want to understand the diversity of human experience, the different ways of in which people across years have thought about all the big questions, right? The meaning of life and death, the vocabularies of love, why, what does it mean to to lead a good life, right?
Hmm.
So studying South Asian lit is, in a sense, one reason to study it is to understand all of these major cultural traditions, right, that play such a big part in the world today.
Hmm.
The other big reason I would say is that South Asian lit is also a lot of it is written in English, right? And a lot of the most exciting work in English language writing is coming out of South Asia, either by people who live in South Asia or by people of sort of South Asian heritage who are trying to write about their hybrid lives abroad, right? And that too is another reason to read it. So when you open up this box called South Asian Lit, what you're also opening up is the same box called English Lit, but in this sort of very new and exciting way, right?
Hmm.
That's kind of multicultural and full of all of these strange influences, right? Um, and finally, I would say it's also a way of being an informed and engaged citizen. I do think, for instance, one of the big themes of 20th century South Asian literature, right, is the question of the event that's known as the partition of British India, which I'm sure you're familiar with, right? And this is the greatest forced migration of the 20th century, the largest. We don't know how many people died. We assume it's between 1 to 5 million. We assume something like 10 million people were turned into refugees, right? This is a major, major event. And the literary engagement with this tragedy is so complex and so full of life affirming lessons that I
Hmm.
think there's something all of us can learn about how to move on past hatred or how to deal with enduring um, conflicts in society, right? From these kind of works. So I do think they also have a lot of lessons about what it means to be a citizen of the world. And you could say something similar, for instance, about the writing by people from South Asia who became indentured laborers, right? And
Hmm.
ended up in the Caribbean, in Guyana, in Fiji, right? Some of the more very, very interesting work, a lot of Canadian literature too, right, comes out of this movement. And this too is absolutely full of lessons for anyone who wants to think about how can you be two or three things at the same time, right? How do you produce meaning out of all of these different things that pull us in different directions, right? So
Hmm.
off, just off the top of my head, these would be my top three reasons for why we should all read South Asian literature, no matter where you're from, no matter what your mother tongue is, no matter what your major is, right? There's something for everybody here.
That's absolutely some great answers. I'm curious as to um, in regards to sort of like as an academic from your experience, like the land, because one of the reasons that like the South Asian literature course and the post-colonial literature course caught my eye was obviously they're not like the most common courses, and
Yeah.
I know like we live in the Greater Toronto area, it's pretty diverse, but even here, like in like even at major universities, some of the largest universities in the world, they're often at the undergraduate level aren't that many courses on things like South Asian literature, East Asian literature, African literature, African American literature, and so on. So I'm curious, like, what have you seen in terms of like sort of changing landscape of academia? Like, has um, certain genres or certain diasporas been given uh, have gotten more notice recently? Have they been given more attention? What has your experience been with that?
That's a good question and an astute observation. I would say, in my experience, as someone specializing in these areas and teaching them, I think the demand for them is growing. The demand
Mhm.
is, and it's often coming from the students, right? It's not necessarily coming from the faculty itself, as in from the, whatever the deans or all the people in charge, the powers that be at the top of the university. It's not
Mhm.
necessarily coming top down, right? It's coming from students who have a deep, deep hunger to understand these issues better, right? And for instance, in the last 3 years, I've been teaching courses on the global South Asian diaspora.
Mhm.
And every year I found, I have students who are majoring in pre-med, looking to become doctors. I have students who are engineers. I have students who are doing history or literature, all kinds of students with all kinds of academic and sort of family backgrounds, but who have this deep curiosity, about, let's say, how we got to where we are today in the world, right?
Mhm.
And so, yes, I do think these courses have not yet been given the place they should be within the curriculum, within the sort of bouquet of offerings you get at major universities. But I think that's going to change very, very fast. I think it's going to
Mhm.
be, 10 or 15 years from now when we speak, this is going to be one of the things that date this conversation as being 2024. In 2034, you're going to be like, wow, there's so much, or at least that's
Yeah.
what I want to believe. So
Yeah.
I
No.
think that's
No.
the direction we're heading. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense, and I think I remember like I was obviously I selected you for an interview, so like I understand kind of like, and I appreciate literature, but I remember being in like high school and even in university, like a few English electives I've taken, like sometimes students aren't really sure like what is like why am I studying, like why am I reading like this, how is it related to me? So I think like I think one of the best things for kind of creating like citizens who read and like kind of engage with just kind of like discussions about like the general public, like public affairs, whether that's through like politics or through like literature or culture. I think just having more diversity in these courses and texts, I think students could kind of see themselves more and would be more likely to seriously engage with them. So uh, yeah,
For
I
sure. I
totally.
mean, I think the stereotypical example is students being forced to read like William Wordsworth's Daffodils, right? And
Yeah.
Wordsworth's a great poet. I have nothing against him. I've enjoyed reading Wordsworth, but you often have people who've never seen a daffodil in their lives, right? And they don't know what it looks like, right? And
Yeah,
there
yeah.
is a challenge here, right? And I do think, yes, the English curriculum has to change to be more welcoming, to make room for new voices and new experiences. And we also have to change some of the ways in which we teach it. I think it's also
Mhm.
our fault a little bit as English teachers. We get so stuck up in sort of teaching people how to do scansion and teaching them about figures of speech and sort of doing the
Uh,
technical stuff, which is very important because that's what allows you to make bigger arguments. But that we sometimes forget the most basic questions, right? Why do you like this story? What is it that's pulling you in? How do you, how are you responding to this poem as you're reading it together, for the first time, for the second time, for the third time, right? And that's something I really try to bring into the classroom. So that it's not. I don't think English literature is only for people who want to do degrees in English literature. Of course, it's for
mhm.
them, but it's for everybody. So I agree with you that I think this needs to change, and it's in the process of changing. And I hope these two courses can be part of that change, and they can bring in people who maybe think, well, I don't know if I want to do an English course. I would say to them, you do want to do this. You can do it. Everybody can read. Everybody has something interesting to say about a work of literature. If you're a human being, you have authority over Shakespeare. Yeah, you whatever you say is valuable, and we can we can build your sensibility together. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Um, so you mentioned teaching. I saw that in 2023 you received a teaching award while you were at Harvard. What sort of things do you think make an English teacher, make a good English teacher, or just make a good educator in general? What sort of like what is your approach to teaching students?
Yeah, I guess this is contextual. Both these courses are going to be smaller seminar courses. I think they're capped at 30, 35, which I think makes for a more intimate classroom where you really get to know all the students. You sort of,
Hmm.
not only do you know everybody's names, but you also know a little bit about everybody. You can sort of sense, oh, this person's going to like this book, or this person maybe is going to struggle a little with this, right? You really build these long-term solid and deep relationships. And I've been lucky. A lot of my teaching has been in seminar settings, and I've really been able to prioritize that both at wherever I've taught in the past and hopefully at York as well, because I've been lucky and I'm getting to teach these seminar courses. So I think that's just where you begin. You begin with sort of meeting everybody where they are, right? I do also think of the time we spend together in the classroom as being almost, it's almost like going to a monastery or something, right? And you have these hours that are set aside, right? Without distractions, without everything else, all the important stuff that you are doing in the rest of your life, right? So I really believe that's a time where we can read together. So another thing that I think really makes for an elevated teaching and learning experience is to do reading together in class. So I really like to bring in just little handouts, a poem, a little extract from something. And then we sort of start with no context, with no background, with no preconceived notions. We just start tackling it together, right?
Hmm.
And I think that's also invaluable because that brings a certain immediacy to that space, right? It's not a space where I come and deliver information for you to sort of write down and take home. It's a space where
Hmm.
we try and build interpretation together. Uh, and finally, I would say I think it's also important to recognize that students today are pretty busy, are commuting very often, have a lot of stuff going on. So I think our assignments have to move away from the traditional long-term paper at the end of the year, which may have made sense in Oxford or Cambridge or wherever else. once upon a time. But I do think we need to move towards shorter exploratory assignments. So, smaller assignments, more concentrated, more exploratory, where you can really say what you think and not what you think I want to hear, right? We're not trying to train our students to become human chat GPTs who can reproduce exactly what they're supposed to say, right? So that's I would is what I would say is my final thing. I think a lot of writing, yes, but writing broken up into small chunks with a lot of feedback and with a lot of time to ruminate about what you want to say. So it's not this sort of knife hanging over you at the end of the year that you got to write this 20-page paper. And even if you don't think you have 20 pages in you to sort of wax poetic about King Lear, you just have to do it. So we don't do that. We sort of have a lot, many more choices, a lot more freedom. And I think that's important too. So I think that's also a cornerstone of teaching English today in the 21st century. So these are things that have worked for me.
Yeah, it's very, I noticed that about your syllabus as well. Like the assignment breakdowns I found interesting, but I think from my experience as well, like um, the classes that seem to have the highest like rate of like student success seem to be with that kind of assignment, like a lot of like little things like and like a lot of feedback seems to be kind of the best way for students to actually learn things and not like hate what they're studying. Um, yeah, I saw that you. So I noticed that you taught some courses on Bollywood film while you were at Harvard, correct?
This is at the University of Pennsylvania, but yeah,
Oh, at Pennsylvania.
I did
Okay.
teach courses on Bollywood and beyond, is what I called it.
Yeah. So I noticed one of the things that was written there was you wanted to focus on kind of like not the less like famous, I guess, movies, and that there were also like other stories that you saw represented in Bollywood that were maybe not talked about as much, touching on themes that maybe were not talked about as much. Could you just explore that a little bit and why you find that interesting?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have always, alongside books, I've always loved films. I
Hmm.
think growing up, we were watching a film a week, as a lot of people in South Asia do. This is sort of the main, this is like the family picnic that everybody goes to together. We don't, our parks are horrible, but our theaters are great. So people love, people love cinema. And I've always loved all kinds of films too. And I think, the Bengali filmmaker Satyajit Ray was really my introduction to the other world of cinema that exists outside of Bollywood and that has existed in all South Asian languages and continues to thrive today. The Pakistani film Joyland recently won major awards, and it has a strong Canadian involvement too, right? So the diaspora is also involved in very interesting ways in this kind of filmmaking. So yeah, I don't want to, I wouldn't call it necessarily art cinema because I feel like that's a term that scares people sometimes because they think, oh, this is going to be boring and slow. I would call it small cinema. So
Okay.
cinema that's made with smaller budgets, with real
Like indie,
locations,
right?
like indie, yes, indie with a focus often on a kind of roughness, right? So the cuts are not as clean, the acting is
Uh-huh.
not as polished, but you can see the real person and the character sort of merging together because that person's maybe not an actor, but someone who's just been cast because of because they know the story and it shows on their face, right? So I really this kind of cinema I think is a lot of it from South Asia is very very beautiful and very very interesting, and yes, it absolutely tells all kinds of stories. There are stories of people fighting caste oppression. There are stories of Joyland, the movie I mentioned, is about a sort of trans performer in contemporary Pakistan. There are stories of migration from the village to the city or back. There are stories of travel abroad, and there's also this undercurrent of humor, right, and life affirmation running through all of this too. One of my favorite essays on cinema tells us that whenever we call movies fantasy or escapist, we're missing the whole point. The audience knows this is fantasy, right? This is not something you can critique a movie for. This is a collective dream we all share together for 2 hours, right? And that too, I think, is an amazing thread that runs through all of these movies. So, yeah, this course, which I hope we can, introduce at York too sometime in the future, it's going to tell you why Shah Rukh Khan is Shah Rukh Khan. It's going to tell you why there's song and dance in Bollywood movies and why people love it so much. It's going to tell you how cinema started in India and why it became so popular, not just in India but across South Asia. But it's also going to tell you what are all the the more quieter and reflective and smaller scale films that people have made in very, very difficult conditions, often with borrowed cameras and limited funding, using their own homes and their own clothes. And yeah, I think, I always tell people, watch more movies. So this course is also a way of just letting more cinema, a cinema that you maybe would not watch or hear of otherwise,
Um,
into your rotation, right?
watch good movies. Watch more
Yeah,
movies is always good advice.
yeah.
I'm curious, like, what is the last film you watched?
The last film I watched, that's a good question. Um, I was watching something 2 days. What did I? Huh. It was a film called Cleo from 9 to 5. It's
Hmm.
by this French filmmaker called Agnes Varda, who's really amazing independent filmmaker from the 60s and 70s. She was the only woman operating in this big bunch of uh, iconoclastic men who formed the French New Wave. One of the only women, and she's one of the best filmmakers there is. This is a film about there's a pop singer who has taken a test for cancer to see if she has cancer, and she has 2 hours while she's waiting for the results. And this movie just follows her through Paris in real time in these 2 hours, and it's just beautiful, and it's full of all of these random encounters. She stops and talks to somebody, and then they have a conversation, and the camera just lingers, right? And it's I would say this is the exact opposite of a conversation in a Hollywood movie, where you feel like every word everybody says is leading up to some grand point. Here you feel like a camera is just filming, and these are two people just talking, right? And the first 30 seconds you're like, why am I listening to this? And 5 minutes in, you want to walk into the screen and live with these people, because they've suddenly become so real to you just by sort of observing them as they live their lives. So um, yeah, strongly recommended Cleo from 5 to 7. I think it's on HBO Max, and it's also on the Criterion channel, which is my other great recommendation for anybody who loves cinema.
Do you have like a million subscriptions? Are you one of those people?
I I probably have more than most people. That's true. I'm
Yeah.
trying to cut them down, like
Where
everybody
where
else.
where would someone go to watch more of like those sort of like indie like South Asian films we talked about?
So, Mubi, MUBI used to
Oh yeah,
have a
I've
lot
heard of
of
that.
them. Uh, some stuff is just on YouTube too, and you can sort of buy,
Oh,
you can rent a specific film. I don't know if the Criterion channel only works in the US, also works in Canada, but you know, if you know your way around the internet, there are ways to access websites that don't quite work in your country as well, right? So I have a lot of friends who watch the Criterion channel from all over the world, which may or may not be strictly something they should be doing, but it's possible. So that's another place, and also libraries, public
uh-huh.
libraries, and the university library, right? Just buy a DVD player. They cost nothing nowadays because nobody wants them, and all our libraries have all of these DVDs just piled up that nobody ever borrows,
Uh-huh.
and it's from all over the world, and it's a lot of beautiful cinema, and you can get into anything you want. Like if you love Tarantino and you want to discover all of his Japanese influences, you can go dive deep into that. If you love South Asian art cinema, you can dive deep into that. And it's not just going to be the York Library. I bet your local public library will also be able to give you DVDs of all kinds of movies that you didn't think they'd have. So that's my other recommendation is, like a cheap DVD player is going to take you a long way, because you can just, instead of paying for subscriptions, just get them from the library.
Yeah, that's actually I've never thought about that. That's actually like really great advice. Um, have you, by the way, you mentioned movie. I have you heard of there's a YouTube channel. I think it's called The Take. They do like video essays.
I haven't,
They
no,
used
I
to be
haven't
called
seen the take.
Screen Prism.
Right. I think I've heard of
So,
them, but I don't, yeah, I haven't really seen too many of
okay.
those. Yeah.
Well, I just mentioned it because that's where I heard of movie. It's like one of their sponsors. They do these really like beautiful kind of video essays on like movies and TV.
Yeah.
I think the kind of person who would be into these courses would also probably like those. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, I'm curious. Like, have you been to Toronto before?
I have been to Toronto. I've been there twice. I'm still learning to say it like the locals do. I think you
Toronto?
gotta not say the last T, right? It
Yeah.
just slips off your tongue, but I'll get there. When we meet in person, I'm gonna be saying Toronto just like you do. But I have been there twice. I had a great time. I went to the distillery, I think is what it was called. That was great.
Yeah.
I got the cheapest haircut I've had in a long time in Chinatown. I went to Kensington Market. It was really nice, really lively. The food was lovely. It was great to be in a major city that has good public transport coming from the US.
Mhm.
That's an absolute blessing, and you
Oh,
guys
that's
don't
so
know how
funny.
lucky you are.
People here always make fun of the TTC. That's so funny.
I'm sure that's a right of urban living. You make fun of the it could be much worse, believe me. You
Yeah.
could so, but yeah, I really like Toronto, and I'm excited to move. Excited to move. I have yeah, I'm gonna be there in a month or two, and I think it's gonna be awesome. Yeah,
Yeah. I think are you interested in the Toronto National Film Festival?
I would be. I've never I haven't been yet, but I think that should be great because
Yeah,
it's one of the big ones.
yeah, and it's in September, so I guess like your first month of being here. So yeah.
Excellent, thank
Yeah.
you.
What novels have you what's the last novel you read as well? I asked about the film. What novel have you read?
So right now I'm reading a novel called The Feast of the Nine Virgins by Jamila Siddiqui. It's
Hmm.
a so Jamila Siddiqui. I shouldn't say I don't know her personally, but Jamila Siddiqui was born in Uganda, and then when Idi Amin expelled the Asian communities of Uganda in the 1970s, she moved to the UK as a refugee. And this book came out in the 90s, and it's her sort of reflecting on, well, it's fiction, but it's sort of about the UK and about Uganda in the 60s and 70s. And the title comes from this custom where if you really want something to happen in your life, you invite nine young girls and feed them. It's some sort of ritual that the character's neighbor does, and there's some sort of sense that God lives in these young girls in some way. And when you feed them, when you sort of invite them over, you get blessed by good fortune, right? So I haven't gotten to the end of it yet, so I can't give you my final take. But it's really interesting. It's very interesting, and it's got everything we were speaking about. It's got cinema. They're trying to make a movie in it. It's got multilingual jokes and puns. It's got Africa and the UK. So it's this is the kind of stuff I live for. So yeah, it's very exciting.
I'm wondering. I want to ask about uh, for someone who is just kind of like reading for reading for pleasure, reading for recreation. What sort of reading habits do you have? Would you recommend to either a student, like academically, or also just on a personal level? What sort of reading habits would you recommend?
Yeah. So I'll just start with the caveat that I don't always follow all of these habits myself, and I'm as prone to distraction as everybody else. But I think I like to have two bookshelves, right?
Hmm.
I think that's a great idea. So you have one set of books that you may be reading for your courses and because you're sort of interested in something, you're reading some nonfiction, something heavy, and then you have another book that's purely for pleasure, right? And I like
Hmm.
to keep the second one closer to your bed so you can read that before you sleep. And that's, so that I love that. I love having giving yourself permission to read just for pleasure. To say, I'm going to read this funky detective book where I already kind of know who the murderer is just because I really enjoy reading detective fiction, right? And so everybody should give themselves permission to do that, right? You're not wasting time. That's great. That's a great use of your time. And the second thing I think is to read before you sleep. I think
Yeah.
that's underrated, right? Because um, you're not as distracted. You can put your phone away for the day. You can put it. I like to keep my phone, like I like to keep my charger in another room. So when I'm sleeping, I'm kind of, I can't be tempted to just pick it up and check it. So you have some time away, and you can have. I also like the rituals. You can have a nice little lamp. You can have a little reading corner, and then it's part of how you sort of wind down. So I think that's
Mhm.
great. That's another great way of getting your reading in, is to just dedicate a little bit of time before you sleep. And it's also nice to read in a community. So if you can read the same book as anyone else in your life, that's great because then you can sit and talk about it, right?
Mhm.
So um, your roommate, if you're living in a dorm, your parents, if they have the time, your friends, whoever, your partner, but read the same thing. So there's somebody to talk about the book with. I think that's also great. That's also a big part of um, making the book a part of your life. So it's not just a task. It's something that's just like you talk about, I don't know, the last episode of House of the Dragon. You can talk about the book you're reading too, right? And it can be just as exciting. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's great advice. It's actually very like sort of the advice a therapist would give. Like in terms of like create a physical space that's separate, two separate bookshelves, create a community. It's almost like an accountability partner. Yeah,
Yeah.
but that's all very good advice. And I do some of those things actually,
Yeah. And
where
books are
try
cheaper.
to.
Books are cheaper than therapy.
Yeah, that's true. Um, yeah, I'm curious. By the way, the detective novels, is it like Agatha Christie? Is that your, are you
Yeah.
someone?
Everybody nowadays have been reading Raymond Chandler, who writes uh, very, hard-boiled. It's almost funny how
Mhm.
determined everybody is to be sort of rough and tough, and this is sort of it's kind of where film noir comes from. So it's got these down and out alcoholic detectives who are just it's got femme fatales. It's all very foolish and all a lot of great fun. So, but I do love Agatha Christie too. She's great. I grew up reading her. Yeah.
Um, I think those are. I think we covered quite a bit. It's always a good sign when the interview goes a little bit longer. Do you
Yeah.
have anything you would like to say about either of your courses or anything you'd like to say about English literature in general?
Um, well, nothing new. I'm just gonna say if you have any kind of curiosity about South Asia, about its art, its culture, its religious traditions, its people, its history, join the course. You're gonna get something about everything, right? I can't promise it's gonna be all about the things you're interested in, but it's a big buffet. So no matter what your flavor is, you're gonna get a little bit of it, right? And the second thing I'll say is if you're interested in trying to understand how colonialism has shaped the modern world in ways mostly bad, but also some things that can be redemptive, some things that we can actually um, look back on and sort of try and learn from too. If you're interested in understanding how colonialism has shaped people's lives, how it's led to this strange world, right, where the prime minister of the United Kingdom is some guy from whose family was from Africa, and then and so on and so forth, but who is of South Asian heritage and so on, right? How did we get here, right? How did the world start looking the way it does today? If you're interested in understanding that, I would say you can't do worse than going for an intro to post-colonial literatures and English course. You're going to read literature from all over the world. You're going to read all about how people have thought about writing, about hybrid identities, multilingual settings, um, exile, migration, travel, self-discovery. So it's sort of a primer course in world history and a primer course in world literature built into one. So if you're interested in any of these things, sign up, and I hope to see you there.
Actually, I did have two questions. I completely forgot. Sorry. Uh, I asked you advice for reading. Do you have advice for writers, either creative writers or like academic writers? Like, what are habits of a good writer?
That's also a good question, and in some ways deeply personal. Everybody finds different things that work for them. So I'll tell you what works for me. When I'm stuck, I like to start writing pen on paper. It slows you down. It hurts. Your fingers hurt. It's actually tougher to write because we've all, no one writes with a pen as much as they used to, right? Uh, I find that it unlocks a slower and more deliberate way of thinking, right?
Hmm.
Because you write slowly. You think about every comma and every full stop. The words flow a little slower, and you can sort of start seeing how they fall into place. So that's one, is if you're stuck, just move to a different place, move to a different medium, move to a different app, whatever it takes, right? Just create something new. Two, I think don't try and sound like what you think you're supposed to sound like, right? Vary the length of your sentences. Make some of them very short and some of them very long. Don't fall into a predictable pattern. read your paragraphs out aloud if you want to hear what the rhythm is like, and your ear will tell you when you should make a change. And you may think, oh, if I end this with a really short sentence, that's going to leave people, that's going to almost be like a cliffhanger, and people are going to want to continue reading the rest of the essay. And you can do this no matter what you're writing, whether it's a boring work email or your autobiography, right? It doesn't matter, no matter what genre you're writing in. So that's number two. And uh, maybe number three would be just read a lot.
Mhm.
If I'm stuck, that's the other thing I do. I just pick up somebody whose prose I like, and you read 3 pages, and you find that you can't concentrate on what they're saying because suddenly what you are saying has come back to you. So then you can go back and write again. So that. These are my writing tips, and I'm sure everybody else has a lot of writing tips that work for them. And that's one of the things I think we do in a literature class too, is sort of come together and write together. So look forward to hearing more about what's worked for students as well.
Yeah, great advice. Uh, so these are sort of like fun questions, I guess. If you
Yeah.
weren't an English professor, but feel free to answer as little or as detailed as you want. If you weren't an English professor, what would you do?
So I'll tell you the things I've tried before becoming an English professor.
Okay.
I tried to be an actor, and I did a small role in a film that's actually set in Chittagong, in what is now
Okay, nice.
Bangladesh, at some theater, but found that was very difficult. I'd get really nervous, and I hated being on set and waiting. I've tried to be a social worker and found that that was very difficult too, because you have to really steel your heart and be ready to see and work in difficult situations. And I've tried to be a journalist, right?
Oh,
And I did that for about a year, and found the daily routine and the pressure of writing a story every day very difficult. So all of this to say, I have no idea. I think if I wasn't an English professor, I don't know what I would be doing and where I would be. Maybe still a journalist.
oh,
That's what I
that
enjoyed the most. Yeah, out of those
okay,
two.
that that really scared me, but you gave me some lead in because I mean, I'm kind of like almost doing what a journalist does. Yeah, and I actually recently started like a in September I'll be starting like a journalism role with the university. It's independent of York, but
Nice. Yeah.
the basically a school paper. So like hearing that, I got a little bit scared. I'm like, oh my god.
See, but it
Um,
is also rewarding. It's also rewarding. You feel great when your story makes an impact. You feel great when
yeah.
important people can't ignore you because you're kind of representing the voice of the public, and it is a real vocation. Like every hardened journalist you'll meet who's been doing this for 20 years will sound cynical, but deep in their hearts they're all idealists. So that's
Yeah.
that's one of the positive things about journalism, right? You meet people who do actually care a lot about
Yeah.
truth and justice and fairness. They just pretend they don't to get by every day, but in their hearts they do. So that's nice.
Yeah, in a way, you're kind of like one of those detectives that you read about. What kind of stuff would you cover as a journalist? So what sort of topics?
I was working for a Mumbai-based daily newspaper, and I covered education. So I was
Okay.
doing schools and colleges, and it was interesting. We did a couple of good stories on changes to the curriculum, or the Right to Education Act was being implemented then in India, which meant schools had to reserve a certain number of seats for people from the neighborhood. They couldn't just so even private schools had to do that, and this was resisted a lot by the schools and by parents.
Mhm.
And so there was a lot. A lot of our writing was about that, about the push and pull, about the court cases, and so on. And we also had writing about just fun stuff. Students go on a trip somewhere and they come back and they're all very excited, or somebody organizes like a cricket league, and so it was a mix
Uh,
of small scale human interest stories and some more old school, reporting. Yeah.
well, yeah, it's very interesting, and I'm curious. Like, is so there seems to be like a bit of a common thread, social worker, journalist, English professor, kind of like a general interest in humanity, right? And like you said, kind of truth, justice, like these things, like post-colonial literature. Would you say that's true? Do you identify with that?
And that's a big claim to make. I don't know. I wouldn't. I don't know if I'm ready to say my career is all about truth and justice. But I think yes, I am interested in narratives and stories and what they do to us, and I'm also interested in Like to me, I feel like a world literature course should not be divorced from the world news section of the newspaper, right? They are both about the real world. And in that sense, I do see a common thread there that you have to be interested in real people. It can't just be about, oh, I'm really deep into this genre and this kind of music or this kind of writing. And that's what, I mean, that's not the kind of energy I bring to
Yeah.
literature. I wanted to, I want to square the circle and bring it back to the real world again, right?
I definitely think that's where some students kind of disconnect from English is when like it isn't connected to kind of the everyday. Okay, this is my last question, I promise. Your favorite Canadian authors?
That's a good question. So I always liked Margaret Atwood a lot. I know that's a slightly cliched answer, but I do think I read a work when I was an undergraduate, and maybe that was the first Canadian author I read, and I found her to be very very interesting. I also like the work of Rohinton Mistry a lot. Mistry was born in Bombay and grew up there and then moved to Canada. And I don't know if you've ever read anything by
Yeah.
him. Some of it is in the post-colonial literature course too. I've always liked his work a lot. I feel like he is somebody who brings back, this kind of promise of realism, right? Which is not to be stylistically boring, but is to sort of capture reality that's actually very tough to understand, right? We need someone to write it down because otherwise it just passes by us in a blur. So I really like his careful and descriptive mode of writing. Um, there's a Indo-Trinidadian writer called Harold Sonny Ladu who unfortunately died very young. But one of his books that he wrote while a student in Canada is called "No Pain Like This Body," and I'm actually trying to write about it for my next project. And it's a book about uh, just a family that lives on a sugar plantation and sort of very close to almost you know what would you call it, like it's a very bare life. It's a very bare life with very little uh, comfort and very little surplus, right? You're right next to the land, and the writing too, I think, is extraordinarily tied to the land itself. Like what you remember from the novel are the rains. What you remember are the frogs that come in the water. What you remember is this sense of physical exertion, which is what it takes to grow sugar, which is actually a pretty physically demanding agricultural task. So that's maybe a more obscure book by a new Canadian author that I really liked a lot. Yeah.
Uh, Great. Thank you so much. Thank you
Sure.
for this interview, and
Yeah. Thank you.
uh,
Thank you so much.
yeah, thanks for replying to my cold email so enthusiastically.